He goes home with a woman. They sit on a rug in her room, which has no chairs, and drink wine and talk until 2 in the morning. She tells him she has to work in the morning and laughs. He tells her he does not, and crawls off to sleep in the bath. He wakes up alone. And then, in the last line of the song, he lights a fire. That is the entire content of Norwegian Wood. 2 minutes and 5 seconds, no chorus, almost no drums, and a story in which every single fact you actually want is withheld. What did he feel? Not stated. Why did she laugh? Not stated. Did anything happen between them? Not stated, and the arrangement of the furniture suggests not. And that last line, is he warming himself at her fireplace? Or is he standing in the street watching her flat burn? Nobody knows. That is not a failure of the lyric. That is the lyric. I want to argue that this is the moment the Beatles discovered that a song could withhold, and that the whole architecture of the record, the instrument, the harmony, the percussion, the length, was rebuilt to make the withholding audible. Start with the situation the song came out of, because it is not incidental. In 1965, John Lennon was married, with a young son, living in a large house in the stockbroker belt outside London, and conducting affairs. He said as much plainly years later. He was writing about an affair, and he was being extremely careful about it, because he did not want his wife to work out what the song was describing. The result, he said, was that he wrote it in such a gobbledygook fashion that nobody could tell. Hold that thought, because it is the strangest artistic brief in the catalog. This is not a songwriter obscuring meaning for aesthetic reasons. This is a man building a confession with a specific reader in mind who must be prevented from decoding it. The song is deliberately engineered to be transparent and opaque at once, to say the thing and to be deniable. And what he arrived at, under that constraint, is a technique that had barely existed in popular music. Total elision. The song reports actions and suppresses interiority. It gives you the rug, the wine, the 2 in the morning, the bath, the fire, and not one word about how any of it felt. Every emotional fact has been surgically removed and replaced with an object. This is Lennon's version of something he had been hearing all year. He was, by his own account and everybody else's, deep in Bob Dylan at that point. The run of albums where Dylan had proved that a popular song could carry ambiguity, ellipsis, and unresolved narrative without collapsing. But there is a real difference worth naming, because Lennon is often described simply as imitating. Dylan's ambiguity is expansive. The images multiply, the song floods you with more than you can process. Lennon's is subtractive. He gives you less than you need. The Dylan song overwhelms, the Lennon song starves. Dylan, incidentally, noticed. The following year, he recorded Fourth Time Around, which uses a near-identical waltzing lilt and a similar domestic scene, and which Lennon found so pointed that he described feeling paranoid the first time he heard it. 2 songwriters circling each other in public, in the only language either of them fully trusted. Now the sound, and here is where the record becomes a piece of engineering rather than a good lyric with a nice tune. The famous fact is the sitar. George Harrison had first encountered Indian instruments on the set of the film they made that year. There is a restaurant scene with Indian musicians, and the instruments were lying around the studio. He was curious. He bought a cheap one in a London shop, on impulse, and he could barely play it. By his own account, it was a poor instrument, and he had no technique. When they came to record this song and the arrangement was not working, he had it brought in. That is the anecdote everybody repeats. What almost nobody explains is why it worked, and the answer is not exoticism. It is harmony. The sitar is not a general-purpose instrument. It has sympathetic strings that ring untouched, and drone strings that sound continuously, and the entire music it belongs to is built on a fixed tonal center that never moves. A raga does not modulate. There is no chord progression. The drone is the ground, and everything happens above it. Which means you cannot put a sitar on top of a normal pop song. The moment the chords change underneath, the sympathetic strings are ringing the wrong notes, and the drone is fighting the harmony. So look at what the verse of Norwegian Wood actually does. It sits on E. It essentially stays there. The melody moves. The acoustic guitar figure moves. But the harmonic ground under the verse barely shifts. And where it does move, it uses the flattened seventh, which is a modal move rather than a functional one. There is no dominant chord pulling the ear home. There is no cadence. The verse is a drone with a tune on it. That is why the sitar fits. The Beatles did not add an Indian instrument to a Western song. They wrote a song with no Western harmony in the verse, which is what made the instrument possible in the first place. And notice what the sitar is actually doing. It doubles the vocal melody. It does not solo, it does not decorate. It shadows the voice at the same pitch. So the man singing is accompanied by an instrument, playing his own line back at him from a distance, slightly out of tune with itself because of the sympathetic strings buzzing at the bridge. The effect is of a voice with a second voice inside it. For a song about somebody saying one thing and meaning another, that is a very precise piece of sound design, whether or not anyone at the session put it in those words. Now, the meter and the percussion, which are the two things listeners never notice and which do most of the work. The song is in a compound, lilting meter. The waltzing three feel that makes it sound like a folk song from a place nobody can name. That is not a rock meter. It has no backbeat available. And Ringo, correspondingly, barely plays. There is no kit-driven groove. What you get is tambourine, maracas, light articulation. The most rhythmically inventive drummer of the era essentially steps out of the record. Take those together, and you have a Beatles track with no chord progression, no chorus, no drums, and no guitar solo. Almost every mechanism by which a rock record generates forward motion has been removed. What holds it up is a repeating acoustic figure and a drone. That is the sonic equivalent of the lyric. Nothing arrives. Nothing resolves. Nothing tells you where you are, except once. There is a single harmonic event in this song, and it is the whole point of it. The middle section, the moment where she tells him she works in the morning and starts to laugh, drops out of the major and into the minor. Same tonic, different world. The sunny modal lilt is suddenly overcast, and then it happens again at the end, when he wakes and finds she is gone. That is the entire emotional content of the song, and it is not in the words. It is in a change of mode, twice, at exactly the two moments of humiliation. When she laughs at him, and when he finds himself alone, the lyric refuses to say that he felt anything. The harmony says it for him, and says it in a language his wife could not have decoded either. Which brings me to the two jokes, because this song is much funnier and much colder than its reputation. The first is the title. Norwegian Wood, in the London of 1965, meant cheap pine paneling. It was what a certain kind of young person put on the walls of a rented room to make it look modern. McCartney, who has always claimed a share of this song, and specifically of the ending, has described the phrase straightforwardly as a joke about cheap wood. A sly class detail rather than anything mystical. The girl is not exotic. She is skint and fashionable and has bad walls. So the most exotic-sounding title in the catalog is actually a snob's private laugh about interior decoration. The second joke is the subtitle. This bird has flown, in British usage of the period. Bird meant a young woman, casually and not respectfully. The line is a pun operating in two directions at once. She is a bird, she is flown, she is gone. It is glib. It is the tone of a man in a pub making a story out of a night that did not go the way he wanted, and it sits directly next to the last line of the song, which is where the whole thing turns. The reading that has hardened over the decades, and which McCartney has confirmed as his intention for the ending, is that the narrator burns the flat down. The wood is cheap and flammable. She humiliated him, went to work, and left him in the bath. So he set fire to her room, and in the very last words of the song, remarks that the wood was nice, wasn't it? If that reading is right, and I think it is, then Norwegian Wood is a song about arson committed out of sexual resentment, sung in a lilting waltz with a sitar over it in under 2 minutes, on a record that people put on at dinner parties. Which is where I have to stop admiring and be honest, because there is a real objection here, and this page is not a fan club. The objection is not that the song depicts something ugly. Art depicts ugly things. The objection is the tone. This is a man's revenge fantasy against a woman who declined him, and it is delivered with charm, with a smile, with the best tune on the record, and with no discernible judgment anywhere in the arrangement. The song does not think there is a problem. And that is harder to wave away with Lennon than with almost anybody else, because he was explicit for the rest of his life about his own history of cruelty and violence toward women, and said so in interviews and in songs, in language considerably blunter than anything I would use here. He described it as something he had been and had to stop being, which means the coldness in this song is not a persona borrowed for the length of a lyric. It is closer to reportage than we are comfortable with. I do not think that makes the record less of a masterpiece. I think it makes it a different kind. Not a charming vignette that happens to have a dark ending, but a genuinely cold-blooded piece of work in which the charm is the instrument of the coldness. The prettiness is not decoration on top of the cruelty. The prettiness is how the cruelty gets past you. There is a second objection, and it is the one I would make as a musician rather than a moralist. The sitar here is color, not grammar. It is used for its timbre, for that buzzing, glassy, unplaceable sound, and not for anything structural about the music it comes from. There is no raga, no tala, no development, no relationship to the tradition beyond the instrument itself. Harrison knew this better than anyone. He was, by his own admission, playing badly, and within a year he had sought out serious study and produced work in which Indian classical form actually organizes the composition from the inside rather than sitting on the surface. So the fair statement is this: Norwegian Wood is the moment a door opened, not the moment anybody walked through it. It matters enormously as a historical event. It is the record that put that sound into the ears of an entire generation of Western musicians. And it does not on its own constitute a serious engagement with the music it borrowed from. Both things are true, and the second does not cancel the first, which leaves the question of why, 60 years on, this is still the song people reach for. I think it is because of something that has nothing to do with the sitar and everything to do with the ellipsis. Almost every popular song ever written tells you how the singer feels. That is the contract. You put the record on, and somebody explains their heart to you at some length. This one does not. It gives you a rug, a glass of wine, a laugh at the wrong moment, a bath, an empty room, and a fire. And it declines to interpret any of it. The listener has to do the work of deciding what happened and what it cost. Which is why two people can argue about that last line for an hour and both be right. And here is the part I find genuinely unsettling. The song was built that way for a shabby domestic reason. A married man needed a version of the truth that his wife could not decode. The formal innovation, the withholding that made this record modern and that 100 songwriters copied, came directly out of cowardice. So the question I would leave you with is not about the Beatles. Everybody has a story they tell in exactly this shape. All the objects, none of the feelings, a laugh where the shame should be, and a last line that could be innocent if you needed it to be. Whose version of you is that story built for? And what exactly are you hoping they will not work out? Where art does not console, it autopsies.